The Occult War, Chapter 7. After bringing Russia down, the revolution directs its efforts against Austria. After having temporarily brought Russia down, all efforts were directed against Austria. The revolution made no mistakes about this country. Hatred, like love, is driven by an unfailing instinct when it comes to what is intrinsically one's opposite. Austria was the most hated of all countries. It was the most visible embodiment of Catholicism, the ancien regime, the concept of personal property, as opposed to the social one of capitalism, the heritage of the Holy Roman Empire, and the ideal of a hierarchical ordering of Christendom under a single scepter. In other words, an embodiment of all that was considered to be most barbarous. In short, Austria stood for the very opposite of the ideals of the revolution: capitalism, democracy, and nationalism, all three of which were utterly contrary to the Austrian and medieval worldview. Now, Austria in the first half of the 19th century was a country of the ancien regime. The reason for this lay not simply in the fact that it was a political monarchy. Capitalism might, in theory, have contented itself with turning Austria into a monarchy ruled by bankers and financial traders. The country, however, consisted of a federation of self-sufficient economic monarchies, governed by a sovereign who was a big landowner free of debts. In other words, an independent ruler. These monarchies were self-sufficient in that they made up for one another as concerns basic goods. Trade, money lending, and agiotage were to be found almost exclusively in the big cities, which were certainly not as big as those of today, yet only constituted a secondary feature of the economy. This was instead based, for individuals as much as for the state, on production, consumption, and exchange. The economic rulers of the country were the landowners, who were often industrialists as well and produced most of the necessary foodstuff with the help of their farmers. There were no complaints, poverty, or strikes, first because this ruling class was patriarchal, and its members, from father to son, were thus visible and personally accountable, and secondly because these landowners had no fixed-term creditors ready to hold a knife to their throats. They were free from debts while paying all of their taxes, for the state was relatively undemanding at the time, not being indebted as today's states are. This is not to say that the Jew played no role, but simply that he did not take the lion's share, one big enough for the Lion of Judah. In economic as well as political and social terms, Austria set the tone for the whole German Confederation, which was comprised of states which were all rather similar in this respect. They consisted of federations of big, patriarchal landowners and industrialists under the paternal leadership of princes, archdukes, and kings, who were landowners and producers themselves. The latter received a just amount of taxes not for the enrichment of usurers, but for the upkeep of famous schools and universities, the police, the law courts, roads, and their small armies. If Austria, albeit stripped of its Italian provinces, had taken the upper hand in Germany, this would have meant the establishment of a reactionary, anti-capitalistic bloc based on feudal property ownership, or rather an updated version of it. This bloc would have cut Russia and the Balkan Peninsula off from the Western democracies. It might thus have prevented the destructive infiltration of the ideas spawned by the French Revolution. The Catholic element, moreover, would have been predominant. Austria had to be destroyed. It was because of this goal that such great importance was assigned to the problem of national irredentism, which had previously been utterly non-existent. We should not forget that in the first half of the 19th century, Austria was even more of a patchwork of different races and languages than at the beginning of the 20th. It not only ruled without granting any constitutions or autonomy over Bohemia, part of Poland, Hungary, and Croatia, in other words, over a Magyar land and 3 Slavic ones with different languages, but it also controlled the whole of northern Italy, the Veneto, Lombardy, and Tuscany. It was thus chiefly in pursuit of the above goal that the ingenious Jews, never to be caught off guard, staked everything on nationalism, which they started fostering. The terrain chosen for their attack was Italy. Italy was no doubt the most vulnerable area of the Habsburg Empire, especially because the peoples of the north of the peninsula were the heirs to democratic and republican traditions, which were instead prominently lacking in the Central European regions. Italian cities had been, for the most part, republican if not democratic. They had always fought against the German emperors. Traces of this remained in the local political temperament. They alone in Europe had professed a sort of patriotism or particularism that was less dynastic than civic, being reminiscent of the spirit of the ancient Mediterranean cities. There were thus good reasons to expect a new idea sparked by Napoleon in the French Revolution to be better received in Italy than elsewhere. Italy was the most vulnerable region of the empire, whose dissolution was so eagerly sought. At the same time, it was the most desirable victim according to the overall plan of subversion. It was not so much by means of democracy and the immortal principles as through nationalism that Austria had to be isolated as far as possible, so as to prevent her companions in misfortune from coming to her aid, for she alone would never have been capable of getting herself out of trouble. After demolishing Austria, there would have been plenty of time to think about what yet remained to be done about the other states. Napoleon III fulfilled his task by declaring war against the Emperor of Austria, with no apparent grounds or provocation, for not even a vague reason was to be found that might somehow have concerned the future of France. Napoleon III simply declared war as he had done with the Emperor of Russia, in order to complete the revolutionary work of 1848. The true and undeclared reason was the following one: the Catholic unity of the Habsburg state, which lay above all national and ethnic differences, was a relic of the Holy Roman Empire, a more limited expression and model of what the Holy Alliance was originally meant to be, but in practice never was. How could the enforcer of the lofty plans of the Great Revolution not contribute to the disintegration of this hated vestige of the medieval order, which was considered so offensive in the age of progress? A second democratic war was thus waged in the name of nationalism. Austria was defeated and withdrew from Italy forever. It lost much of its power and prestige within the German Confederation, where Protestant Prussia now gained predominance. Two other ideals were weakened as a result of this war: the Catholic ideal of Christian political universalism, which yielded to the Protestant idea of nationalist separatisms, and the conservative and feudal ideal, as traditionally embodied by Austria, which yielded to democratic progress. The King of Italy became yet another sovereign ruling by the will of the nation. In fact, he ruled by the will of subversive rather than purely national elements. Hence, the king found himself in an extremely difficult position. For as the heir to a Catholic dynasty of illustrious princes, he represented the conservative ideal. But at the same time, he embodied the very opposite ideal as the involuntary enemy of the Pope, the source of all legitimacy, and the product of the Masonic lodges and other secret societies. Napoleon III himself faced much the same difficulties, for as the head of a Catholic country, he was forced to take the religious feelings of his subjects into account. He could not be a real ally of the new Italy of Mazzini and Garibaldi against Austria. It was even forced to stand in its way at the gates of Rome. His army, which had crucially contributed to the Italian victory and unification, was destined to prevent the Italians from gaining access to their new capital. Ultimately, in unifying Italy, Napoleon III went against his own interest, something which he ought to have foreseen. For a woman will easily forget what has been done for her, but will never forget what has not been done for her. This proverb equally applies to nations. Napoleon III alienated the international front of the right only to be abandoned by the international front of the left. The latter, a habitual priest-basher, was now after the highest priest. From this moment onwards, Napoleon III grew increasingly isolated. Seeing that he could follow her no further, the revolution searched for a different tool and found it in Prussia, in the person of Bismarck. The following is Julius Evola's ending to this chapter. Austria, therefore, had to be destroyed. We should not forget that in the first half of the 19th century, Austria was even more of a patchwork of different races and languages than at the beginning of the 20th. It not only ruled, without granting any constitutions or autonomy, over Bohemia, part of Poland, Hungary, and Croatia, in other words, a Magyar land and 3 Slavic ones with different languages, but it also controlled the whole of northern Italy, the Veneto, Lombardy, and Tuscany. The chosen tactic consisted of laying particular stress upon the previously non-existent issue of national irredentism, while closely linking the idea of nationalism to the liberal, democratic, anti-traditional, and anti-hierarchical one. The chosen terrain for the first phase of the attack was Italy. Events unfolded as follows. In Italy, 2 traditions and heritages coexisted. The first one, the oldest and most genuine, was the Roman, Catholic, and aristocratic tradition. It found expression in Dante's Ghibelline and feudal Italy, that of the distinctly Italian princes who, starting from the Savoy and Monferrato families, had never hesitated to take up arms in defense of the rights of the emperor and nobility at the time of the insurrection of the Italian city-states. The second tradition was the democratic one of these city-states, which was particularly strong in northern Italy. As a consequence, this region was one of the most vulnerable areas of the Habsburg Empire. What may rightly be described as the shadiest side of the Italian Risorgimento, which betrays the influence of the secret forces of world subversion, consists in the fact that the ideal of Italian unification came to be exclusively associated with the second of these traditions. The idea spread by Napoleon in the French Revolution became tools in the hands of the Masonic lodges and the Carbonari. The greatest effort was spent in trying to make Italians forget about the first of the aforementioned traditions, in other words, of their Roman, imperial, and aristocratic heritage. The stake here was twofold. On the one hand, the aim was to open a crack in the empire that was to be demolished. On the other, it was to turn Italy into one of the most desirable victims according to the overall plan of subversion. Napoleon III, etc. This is the end of Chapter 7.